Okay, so I want to talk a bit about what I've been working on lately. HTML bars and the view layer rewrite. The rewrite is currently in beta. For most apps, it should be pretty drop-in. There are still a few issues that we're working out, but that is mainly I'll get into them a little bit more down the road. This is a little JS bin that one of the guys working on HTML bars made. His name's Martin. This is just showing you what the template compiles to. And this is a blank HTML bars template. I'm going to start from here, even though I'm going to go into the view layer rewrite that's currently in beta. This is not part of the beta yet. The view layer rewrite stuff is designed to support these style templates. So the difference between the current handlebars templating is it templates output string. You give it a context when you call the function, and it returns the string. Problem with this has been you have helpers like bind adder that need to know what the attribute is you're setting instead of being able to say attribute equals and then doing a binding syntax in the value. So this is just an empty template. So what this template is going to return is an empty document fragment. Templates have two parts to them. One part that builds the DOM in the fragment, and then the other part that just executes it. So the first thing it does is sees if there's a cached DOM already built. Then whenever you execute this empty template, it's just going to clone that and return it. So if we type hello, we'll see now the DOM builder is just going to create a text node that says hello, and your output from this template is going to be a single text node that says hello. If I add a tag to this, I'm going to get an error. I have an unclosed element. Before in Ember, if you accidentally had an unbalanced tag in a template, since it was a string, and that template happened to be very deeply nested in your hierarchy, that unclosed tag would get fixed by the browser during the initial render when it brought the entire tree into DOM. And so it would be fixed at some level very far removed from the mistake. And either your page looked messed up, or maybe your page looked okay, but then your little hidden Metamorph tags were unbalanced, and so things did not update properly, or they threw an error on update. Now you just get something right away. Now this is going to create an element, a text node, append that, and then that's what's going to be cloned every time you run the template. So none of these templates I've done so far have had any bindings. Now if I make this binding, you can see now it added a couple things. After it clones the fragment, it's going to create a morph, which is basically like basically tracks where to insert dynamic content. So the idea is you clone the DOM that you've already built, then you create this thing that knows where updates go, and then you call into the helpers to put content at those points. And so the first thing is cloning that. The -1 just means that that morph owns the whole content of that paragraph element. So anytime you call update on it, it's just going to set the entire content of the paragraph element. How that's done is not built into the template. So anybody could use htmlbars just for this program. It has no runtime. You pass everything in so a context, an environment which defines hooks, which will be called, so a content hook is going to be, means that that binding was parsed inside the content of an element. The DOM are just a set of helpers that it consults for how to create nodes. So it doesn't even here use any DOM like methods directly. It's just asking, there's basically a set of, so you could give this fake DOM, whatever kind of DOM, and so this is all the compiler does and all the template does. It's very different than handlebars, which you actually had to pre-register helpers globally. This always just calls a hook. So hello could be a helper. It could be I want to bind to a property called hello. That's all up to the framework to decide based on the environment that was passed into the template. A little bit older version because this doesn't actually fully have the contextual element stuff. But this is just, if my template is just a document fragment, I don't actually know what element I'm beneath. So if, say, I was a table row, the contextual element just allows you to pass in an element to serve as the context that you're going to be rendering this into. This helps with a few sort of edgier things like SVG, because just and some tables stuff. That I'm go back to talking about just bindings now. So this is the binding. See, without an element, it's actually, instead of, it has to create a document fragment. The two extra text nodes serve as boundary for dynamic content. So when I go to create the morph here, it is telling me basically that the first node underneath that fragment and the second node underneath that fragment are the boundaries to place dynamic content between. That's what allows a helper or a binding to update in that spot. Now if I
Kris, your text nodes there are taking the place of the script metaphor tags.
Yes. So the reason what Metamorph was because it was a string, and then it got realized in the DOM, you needed something you could find by an ID in order to serve as the boundaries. But since we're building DOM, we can build an empty text node to then track the boundaries without doing anything that affects CSS or style. There are some edge cases in that we also are cloning the node, and some browsers don't produce a perfect clone. They normalize. So they remove empty text nodes, namely IE. And I think there is a similar issue when Safari clones SVG. But we have something that repairs that. And if a browser is really bad, we probably just have it just run the build DOM program every time the templates run instead of bothering with clone node. So clone node, if you actually touch every node that you've cloned, it's the same performance as running the build program again. But if there is a lot of DOM that you don't actually manipulate or touch in your JavaScript, it's significantly more performant to clone it. And then when you're inside like something like an each, every time you execute, let's say your each didn't even have any bindings in it, you'd just be cloning the DOM per row and appending it. So with that, let's look at a block helper. Well, actually, let's go back to doing the context. Let's say this was the old style, right? Is bind adder. So this, you can see before was content. Now that I'm in a, now that I'm inside the element, this has now become an element hook. And so it's given the actual element when it executes the binding text, context, and then arguments describing the binding. So if it was like this, it says that it was unquoted, so that should be a binding and not a literal Then what you'll soon be able to do actually, since this should just actually be able to work at so now the element, it's still an element hook, but what it's passing in is like saying that this is an attribute that should call, basically this is becomes a call to helper called attribute that's passed an argument of class and then an argument to be the value that is a sub-expression of my foo binding. So this tells the helper that it should set class to the result of this sub-expression. Now if I want to say something like anchor this is now going to be href and a sub-expression that's going to call concat, and then its arguments are going to be an array values. First is a literal, next is a sub-expression domain, and my literal slash between the two, and then a sub-expression path. So soon, instead of bind adder and a computed property, you'll just be able to bind values directly.
Thank you. Yes, this is going to be good.
Yeah. So attribute. Yeah, I think I covered all of the spots that you can basically put in. So that's all the context. So let's look at block helper. Let's say so block helper is actually two templates. A block is a template, and then there's a template for the outside. So there's actually going to be two fragment programs. One that's just creating a list item, another that's creating an ordered list. This is the block is set to a variable that is then passed in to each so the helper every time it executes this for each row, the first time it creates the element, the second time it just clones it. So if I had a lot of sort of structural HTML that actually wasn't dynamic, that's where that becomes beneficial. And this template, it would be just as well enough to just call build again. So in the new view layer, views basically become context for running a block helper, and views themselves kind of render in the same fashion. So every view is outputting DOM now instead of a string, and that DOM is going to place morphs in. And instead of recursively calling into its child views to append to this big string buffer, it's going to enqueue the child views for rendering, and then when those child views render, they're going to be updating those insertion points, the morphs of the view, the view created during its render. Now, that is currently what's in beta. And the way it works now, since it isn't using htmlbars yet, it's using the old templates. When they render a string, it immediately converts it to DOM, and it does every time you call into a helper, it outputs like a Metamorph script tag with a single one instead of a boundary, because it just needs to know that point. And at the end of that view rendering, since it doesn't recurse into the children, the IDs only need to be scoped to that single view's rendering, and they're replaced then with the morphs, and then the template. Basically, the view's output from the old templates ends up being the same as the output for that htmlbars will do out of the box. And right now we're currently rewriting helpers, but there's a few more sort of reworkings that we're doing to the existing sort of templating and helper layer. And likely we are going to apply those still to the existing. What goes in master will likely for a time period, even when we have helpers that support htmlbars and merge those in, will support both templating layers until we are fully confident we haven't missed anything. But that adds some stuff to really kind of clean up the helpers, which are kind of a mess right now, to make them very consistent about quoted means literal, non-quoted means bindings, and there's a second sort of piece on handlebars called bound templates that basically takes that the helper calls from HTML bars, and like takes all of the things that are unquoted and creates a stream out of them, which basically is a value that can be notified when it changed, and then it can ask for its current value whenever, to make the bindings a little basically kind of take it. Every helper right now has to kind of process the options that handlebars gets it, and so that's what makes the helpers inconsistent, or like, or for a time period when keywords was added, not every helper actually could bind to a keyword because every helper had to kind of reprocess the stuff that was passed into that helper, and we're just doing tons of housekeeping, and there's just a lot of really cool things coming down that I'm very excited about. Stuff I wanted to do for ages. I want to actually show let's see, what's the one, two. So this is a sort of render loop that's responsible for rendering so the basic, ignore most code, just basically it's a loop, and for every view in the tree it's going to have it create an element, then push its children then move on to the next loop. Its children are going to create an element, push their children, go on until you run out of things that are enqueued, and then you're going to start going back down and inserting their elements into their parent until you get back down to the root. And you insert the root, and then you go back and notify everything that they have been inserted. Now, a lot of this was kind of spread through EmberView. What I'm working toward is to have or to be able to have a simpler view to do a lot of the kind of core supporting views, instead of the everything using the sort of user-facing view that has a lot of things and features and stuff in it that most of the sort of glue views don't need. It also just I don't know if it's actually easier. It looks crazy, but it's easier to step through this than it actually was the previous view, and just removed a ton of code, a ton of, since I've walked the tree to render it, I know everything that needs to be called to insert, whereas in before, every time you did anything on a view, when you wanted to say notify did insert element, you walked the entire tree recursively calling did insert element. Debugging that was not fun, or like stepping through that was not fun. It also not very performant. Let's see what else too. I have like little notes on what I. So just some of the things that people have run into in the beta is that there were some people who were actually in their view rendering, since it was string rendering, pushing out unbalanced HTML that they were finishing later in some other view. And while that kind of worked in previous versions of Ember, that actually usually messed up the Metamorph tags, so things pass that point when it update correctly or lose track of the state. So some may see that as a regression, but it was never like fully supported and not something that we ever encouraged. But now it's critical that all views render balanced HTML because it's turned into DOM at the point that the view renders and not at a root. So that's the main issue that we've run into. A few people were trying to create views and append them from make-bound helper, which make-bound helper actually created a lightweight view that is a leaf only and didn't support children. But appending a view, because it was recursive, so you were still under the parent's rendering, still worked from make-bound helper, even though it produced like a view hierarchy that didn't actually match how it was rendered, and the Metamorph tags were unbalanced, but as long as you never re-rendered that view, it worked, and now that is definitely something that's going to fail right away. But other than that, people have largely just been able to drop it into their applications. If you're using Ember CLI, you can just update the Bower JSON to point at Canary and try it out, or beta channel. Does anybody have any questions on?
So you were talking about did insert element because we're rendering DOM already. That like there's sort of a gap between after render and did insert element. Like,
So one of the things that's not done here is that, so this is doing a loop for like one subtree, which in the beginning, in your initial rendering, is going to be the whole tree. But for updates right now, it's and this is still scheduling on the run loop. What I have work in progress is that the renderer schedules on the run loop, and then everything else schedules with the renderer. And so the renderer is aware of all rendering and queued, and is going to queue up the did insert element hooks and run them after rendering is complete. So you shouldn't need after render anymore. just do stuff on did insert element. And most people just wanted to do that, that's where they wanted to shove their jQuery stuff in. And most jQuery plugins force layout, because most jQuery plugins do height measurement or width measurement and add CSS. They're just hugely non-performant things they do that you want to have happen only once. And the problem is that when currently now people do that on what's the scrolling jQuery plugin that puts anchors, waypoints. People would do something like that and did insert element, and likely they're putting scrolling waypoints because they have some big list. The problem is initially when that renders as one tree, all those did insert element hooks are going to be called after the rendering's done. And as long as none of the did insert element hooks do anything that invalidate the layout, forcing the layout would be okay, because you force it once, and then when you go to read the height, the browser already knows it because it hasn't been invalidated. The problem is then when you start changing the list, and then it starts to go and say, okay, the first of this items, and renders that tree and calls did insert element, that forces the layout, and then some other thing enqueued in the run loop goes to render something else, and that invalidates the layout. And you can get into a battle where you have many updates scheduled on the run loop, and many of them are forcing the layout repeatedly, and this can make it so you can barely scroll your page. And so I'm hoping to basically make the renderer just smart about that, and sequencing, re-rendering, and updates, and a number of other things. We'd like to add keys to each so that we can identify when you've moved stuff, so we can keep what you have in the DOM instead of re-rendering it when you remove something and insert it at a different point. It's like when you resort something, you won't lose the state you have on your views or components. I just got a lot of things planned for that.
The state of rendering on the DOM, rendering on the server and pushing it to the page?
So see everything, so right now beta doesn't have this totally yet, but what we're working toward is everything in the view layer goes through that DOM helper API. So instead of actually creating DOM, it says I'd like to create an element. So you should be able to return a virtual tree DOM that just outputs string for your rendering. Now, if you do stuff with jQuery on did insert element, you might need, there is some thing in Node that kind of emulates jQuery, but if it tries to measure stuff, like height and width of an element, you're not going to have a good time there. But the one thing is if you call create element on a view instead of append, it will do all the rendering minus the did insert element hooks. So if you want to just get your rendering minus the insertion for a template, or if you just don't do any jQuery stuff, or maybe you conditionally wrap it, you should be able to render the templates on the server. I'm hoping that we'll have like a, I don't know, we are going to do this, I just don't know, like I have a timeline on it, but we'll have like DOM helper library that has the basic implementation of the interface that outputs a virtual DOM that you can use to render your template.
So that's
Can
Didn't you already go?
Yeah.
Okay. Somebody else has a question.
It was related. It was fast food. It's adding on to that.
So Kris, last time I heard you speak to the ABC News sponsor, and you had actually told Jake and I that you wouldn't recommend using Ember to render long lists necessarily. There may be better ways of rendering your
Are you sure you're not thinking of Ember data? I'm
those
pretty
are-
sure that I was talking about just there for long, like lots of data on a page. Generally, like the sort of because it repeats schema in the payload, and it's actually a lot faster just to send data that you know the structure on the client and just basically render that. But yes, list performance is something that we're definitely, this is part of. There's still some other pieces that we have to attack around. So HTMLbars itself renders lists and incredibly fast.
I was going to ask if it makes rendering that makes you feel more comfortable because clone nodes.
But there's stuff that we do in the helpers now that is, and the helpers are executed per row, right? So there's stuff in the helpers that is still slow, right? And they get run on every row. Now there is a lot of stuff that they do that they did the previous row, and the previous row, and the previous row. And part of the idea of going back to the did insert element and the after render, getting things in this one big loop, is so we can create, you know, a cache for stuff that's done repeatedly during render and flush it at the end. But a lot of that is sort of like micro syntax. So when you do, you can see in this, in the first thing where it gives you a nice, like, linear, simple program for everything. But when you do, like, let's go back to, so if we have one thing to say, class equals whatever, this, it's another when you start doing the syntax, like, sorry, let's say, because this comes in as just this. So all it knows is that you didn't quote it, and that's what it is, because this colon syntax is not actually part of HTMLbars. It's part of the view layer class name binding, and right now every view for every row you create is going to parse this out, and say you have many of them. You have the like not case. So we still have to attack that. You can now kind of write something like that in. Let me get back to this and see if I can remember. There is like a sub-expression way of doing that. I'm just kind of blanking on my mind what it's so a little more verbose, but the idea is that you might, there may be a way just to write it as a if sub-expression that, conditionally binds that class. But that is going to be a little longer. The main focus right now is just to keep trimming fat off of what is to create a view. Does every view need to actually be EmberView? Having a cache for the duration of render for stuff that's repeated on each row. There's just a host of things that we're attacking there, but we do have various sort of minimal, just like implementations of the hooks that I showed you, and just Ember's observers to make them dynamic, just to show that at some bare level it can be extremely fast, and then we're basically working toward that.
I started to notice this layer comes up. I think you kind of addressed it, but in more detail. It says Metamorph tags such and such have different parents. The browser is fixture, output, valid, and HTML. It says, for example, you might not have properly closed T1 tags. But like within each table.
Yes, that is something that we have. That's not, and so that you're not on the beta. Yeah, that's on the previous one.
I'm kind of curious before and after. If I go to beta,
we're not done with. We are hoping that basically. So I'll just. We don't have this yet, but we're essentially right now this isn't, but what it should be doing is creating a T-body, because this is valid HTML, it's not valid DOM. And stuff like, if you were to inner HTML that on a div, it would insert a t-body, because that's DOM spec. This is just following the tokenized spec and reflecting it here, but we do want to do the auto table body insertion. When you do this, this is what those two will be what it still creates, and the table body insertion would be the job of the morph.
So like to make it correct today, you would just put the table body outside of each, and that would resolve the warning and do the right thing. If you're correct about the markup.
Yeah, right now if you put it in yourself, so right now in Ember, that's technically if you don't put that in there today, and you have a helper there, the Metamorph tags are basically when you initially render, you would get auto table body insertion, but that auto insertion would mess up your Metamorph boundaries, and you couldn't re-render that collection view without messing up the basically the start and end range are weird. One starts outside, they have different parents, and so it's no longer a range that you can successfully update without potentially having just weirdness. And so there are cases, so in a lot of cases it will work, and then there are cases where updating will produce messed up output. We plan to fix that because we actually understand a little bit more about the DOM structure and have more context. So we want to go from the valid HTML and produce valid DOMs. So we're hoping to come up with some rules for that. But there still might be edge cases where, like, if you call in a helper that outputs a TR and you're inside a table, we'll insert a table body, but then if you suddenly output like a table footer from that same helper, we're likely to say, okay, if you rely on auto table body insertion, then you have to keep relying on it and your helper. And so
what is the behavior around the strictness in the new regime here? Will it just give you warnings, or will it not? Will it fail?
Right now, since we're still doing, so in beta, so in the template, it just gives you a warning when you compile the template. It won't compile. So you get it right away. In the beta right now, your view is still producing a string when it's rendering. We're going to turn that into DOM using the browser's parser. The browser is going to autocorrect it. It's autocorrecting is since we're only putting a single script tag as here's where the dynamic content goes, because we don't recurse in to populate the dynamic content because it's non-recursive. There's less chance that you'll end up with something broken. And since the fix is very local to that single view rendering, likely the auto fix of your DOM is likely just to work. And you won't notice it until you then upgrade to htmlbars, and then you can't compile one of your templates. So that's...
I would recommend some clarity around, realize clarity around meaning. Why? I think it's good to throw the air, warn people early and often. Doing something strange here.
Yeah, it's... I like getting compile time errors myself and to know that the templates are... If you've ever, in the existing one, before it had that assertion you're talking about the Metamorph tags, it was pretty difficult to debug if you had a template that had a malformed or unbalanced tag, because it usually was just so far removed from... You'd navigate to a route and then it would be broken, and you'd have like no idea what broke your page. And yeah, the string. So there's a lot of like security benefits of this, because in the other one it was like had to escape every piece of rendered content. In htmlbars, you have a program that builds DOM. All text that comes into it is going to go into DOM, and then the browser is going to escape it. And so, I mean, there you still have to worry if you do a binding to an href, but there is a lot less security issues with htmlbars. It's definitely more secure by default. Do you still use triple curlies? That is going to go back to parsing the HTML, and but maybe we'll also have a mode that just makes triple curlies an error if you feel like you want an extra level of security. But it would be good for everybody, has apps, try and this out.
So you
I
say,
know Gordon's running it in production, so.
oh, wow. So you say it's in Canary.
And beta.
Canary and beta right now.
For metal views, not HTMLbars yet.
Okay, so if we wanted to try HTMLbars, how can we try?
Not all the helpers. You can try it, but it's not. You can try HTMLbars itself, but you're going to have to implement the hooks. I mean, the tests use like a default set of implementation of those hooks, but they don't actually handle observing. You just so anyway, you can look at the tests and kind of get a sense for how it's going to work. There is a branch off of Ember, but it does not have probably enough of the helpers implemented to, well, it would, yeah, I'm going to run production on it. But I mean, a lot of the tests pass. It is very close. I mean, I know it seems far, but a lot of the work on it is layered, and as it comes in, a lot of it's just going to start working. I mean, there's a lot of things around bindings it fixes. Like before, there were still some things that required, so whenever you use like a keyword like foo in each, foo in whatever, if you then bound something to that keyword, actually anything you chained off of it would update if that property and the object changed, but the keyword itself changed, required a re-render of the view. And that's the way the templates now work. Like every binding you see is like, okay, observe this key in a context and some root. And keywords will say, okay, well, here is, you know, this is represent the context that I've captured, bind stuff off of this, but nothing observed that as a key in its original context. And streams allow us to kind of capture that context and key and pass it down in a way that all of that will be bindable, because what we're moving toward, let's see, is that, say, each would be, instead of each, so going back to that key context idea and having to know what the context is at every point, that template would the template would be the same context all the way down, and each wouldn't actually shift context, but would be able to yield back an item to the block. So you might write something like we haven't nailed down syntax with this, so maybe because the so the idea is that there's kind of a tension right now between components. You know, originally Ember, way back before 1.0, the view was the context, right? And that was nice in that the view was very reusable, except that you were constantly having to pass stuff around, which is the same thing that kind of people get into with components. They don't like having to bind everything in, but that isolation is what makes them very reusable. So we went to the controller, becomes your context, and then everything preserves that, but then it becomes unclear, okay, what does this template need to successfully render? Where's all this stuff coming from? So the idea in here is then helpers don't shift context. Your context becomes your component, and then helpers can do stuff and then yield back things. So then you don't need the item controller, because I have my item from my each, but I still have my items. So I don't need is selected on my item controller, because I just have an is selected helper. I can put that in an attribute. And so that is where we're going with that. There's the idea too is that helpers could yield back a parameter that can be invoked as a block, so they can be invoked as a helper. So say you had like a grouped by items type item header and this would be something it could then invoke so this syntax, like I said, is not decided on, or I know, but the idea is still the same in that this would give this component a block it could render and yield the type, and it would call that for every like group set of rows, and then call the main so the basic idea is to make it so that things have their internal state that doesn't leak out unless they actually yield it, but they don't name it. The template consuming it names it, so it's always consistent, right? So I can say each person's and have it yield back. It just knows it's iterating over something and yielding back something, and the template would name that argument person. Everything would be person.name, and you'd still have your person thing, so you could just in the template call helpers that outputted computations based on things from various different scopes, and it's very clear where everything is coming from because it's all named. Anything that doesn't prefix comes from the component that's rendering that template. Everything that has a keyword was introduced explicitly in that keyword named in the template, and those keywords are bindable. And well, just I think it's going to be cool. So that's I think this is going to be the best of, for most of you probably have no idea what I'm talking about with the view preserves context, and that, except for maybe Gordon, because he's the only one I think here who knew Ember before 1.0. So yeah, that's anyway. So that's that. Just an inside, I just want to do a quick promo of something cool because it was from Joe's thing. Stefan has this draggable each helper, which you can see. This app is more just to test that it's, handling various cases, but you can see it's draggable each. And these have, you can say that a specific spot is, should act as handle, have actions when things are moved, have stuff to make it like a drop target and various other options. This, you can see, now the interesting thing about this is, see this as, it's saying what my view is. You'll notice that when I move it here, it's actually not re-rendering the view. It's actually moving the element, and the view instance and element is staying the same, and the parent view is being updated. And I can reorder these two lists. I think he may have not restricted me to taking one. Okay. Anyway, so that's using, that is a helper integration with the jQuery sortable. That makes it easy to use and do what you were showing in the app. It's probably a lot less effort than you were. So just wanted to promote that in response to your talk.
Thank you.
Yeah.
I just want to say thanks, Jake, for getting us here, and thanks to the rest of the classmates, guys, for.
Okay, just the door's probably.